Welcome to the Indian Gaming Association's The New Normal webcast. My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm the conference manager for the Indian Gaming Trade Show and Convention. I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone is muted by default except for our speakers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box and they'll be brought up at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Victor Rocha, conference chairman of the Indian Gaming Association.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. My name is Victor Ocho. Welcome to the New Normal, your go-to source for conversations about the gaming industry and critical issues facing Native American tribes. I'm the conference chairman of the Indian Gaming Association. My co-host Jason Giles is not here today. He's handling IGA business. He'll be here next week. But we have three very important voices joining us today for a very important discussion on sweepstakes in California and in the industry in general. We have Michael Honig, Vice President and Associate General Counsel of the Yohaviatam of Samuel Nation. I hope I'm getting better on that. I promise I'll have
You
it
have it,
down.
Tom. You're getting there. It's you have it, Tom.
Yohaviatam. All right. Our dear friend Scott Carl of the Scott Carl Office's Tribal Advocacy Group. Good morning, Scott. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing quite good, Victor. Thank you.
And our good friend Howard Glazer, Global Head of Government Affairs and Legislative Counsel at Light and Wonder, and a guy with a really cool library in the background. How's it going, Howard?
Thanks for having me, Victor.
Good. I'm glad I didn't use my library background today, so we stuck with my regular guitars one. Gentlemen, welcome, very welcome. We have a lot to talk about. Over the weekend, we had the governor of California, Governor Newsom, sign AB 831. For a while there, it was kind of a guessing game. When we were at G2E, we were like, when is he going to do it? Is he going to do it? I personally thought he would let it become law and didn't sign it, but he signed it on Saturday. And Scott, were you surprised?
Pleasantly, the way he kind of immediately undermined Attorney General Bonta when Bonta announced the DFS agreement made me, suspicious that he was too friendly to illegal gaming operators, but he came through and signed. So.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a journalist from Politico the other day, and it was about Bonta, and it kind of, when I got away with the conversation, and as I told the reporter, is like, Bonta's kind of ahead of the game, not doing something isolated, but I think, we live in this environment where, every single attorney general in all 50 states is starting to wonder, what happened here? This gaming thing got away from me. One day we were in bliss. Next thing you know, we find out there's these sweepstakes and prediction markets. And if you're the Attorney General of Utah, I imagine, they're very shocked at this. So, I think California is where the rest of the states are have gone and are going. Howard, welcome. I think you know a little bit about that. How many states have signed on to the sweepstakes bans at your last
Well,
count?
since this effort began, which is about a year ago, at G2E, where AGA did a session there, and then you began to take the issue on right around a year ago as well. Since that time, 17 states have taken action to affirmatively declare that sweepstakes gambling is illegal gambling under their state law. That's 17 states. And then there are 6 states that, by the existing laws, made it very difficult for sweepstakes operators to conduct their business in the state, and most of them excluded already because of the risk. That's 23 states effectively it's illegal in. The number of states that stated or declared that sweepstakes gaming is legal, 0. So it's 23 to 0. It's 50% of the population in the U.S. That's a kind of extraordinary to accomplish in a 1 year time. It's very difficult to get regulators, legislators, attorney generals, other enforcement mechanisms to take on an issue and act on it within the same year. And most states, the ones that passed bills, and there are several that did a bill like California, it was unanimous, as it was in California. So there really wasn't any effective opposition, because people saw this for what it is, which is once you parse through the dual currency and all the rest of that nonsense, you know it when you see it's gaming. It's gambling. It's paying money for a chance to win money, and that's essentially what it is. And I assume that there are other states may act. It almost doesn't matter at this point because the particularly with the California law, which includes I call them enablers and facilitators. This would be payment processors, suppliers, investors, affiliates are at great legal risk, a risk they didn't think they had a year ago. Now they understand the risk. They're leaving the field, leaving the operators out on their own. And you can see the operators, the sweepstakes operators, they're really grasping at straws to find a way to stay in the business. They'll mutate it, evolve it a little bit. But I think for the most part, this has been a successful effort. California was the most important piece. Most populous state, it's at least 20% of sweepstakes revenue. $100 million in advertising is going in there, maybe even more. The effort by the tribes is like nothing I've ever seen. I've been in this business for 45 years, and this was an extraordinarily well thought out, executed, funded campaign that brought together all the tribes, the associations, the IGA, CNIGA as well, but also the commercial operators, suppliers like my company, sports betting, digital advocates, which have not always been on the same side, and responsible gaming advocates. So you had people from different points of view on other issues that don't always agree with everything, united on this one, and it shows you what the industry can do when they stand together. I really think it's a powerful statement.
You know what? As we said before we went on, I was checking my records last night, and it was exactly 1 year tomorrow that we had our very first webinar on sweepstakes. And like you said, it was at G2E where a lot of us were waking up to the threat that was happened right underneath our nose. And you see it every day when you pick up your app to check up Instagram. There's Monopoly Go, and there's other ones that Chumba, and all of a sudden they expected, and Michael, they were in California and they expected us to sit on our butts while they continued raking in the money. You know, Samuel was at the very front of this thing. Also, there was no issue in getting them activated, or Siniga, or Tassin, or any of the other groups. Michael, what was the response from the tribe to from the internally?
I think Tom, like all California tribes, when they realized what an issue this was becoming, the amount of money that was flowing to these companies through not just California, but nationwide, I think they recognized the threat pretty early on and decided that, Tom, along with the other tribes, needed to step up and do something to put a stop to this. And so, Tom, along with Siniga and Tassin, sponsored AB 830, or went to Assemblyman Avellino to sponsor AB 831 to essentially do what was already, I think, clear in California law, or at least what should have been clear in California law, that these sweepstakes are illegal. But as we all know, these sweepstakes companies, these online dual currency sweepstakes companies, tend to live in the gray areas. And if there's a loophole that they think they can exploit, they will try to exploit it. So the idea here was to clarify that California law makes this illegal. What the online sweeps companies we're doing now is no different from what the internet cafes were doing, 10, 15 years ago when that was stopped. It's the exact same model. It's online and you're using coins instead of internet cards or phone cards or whatever, but it's the same thing. But we just needed to clarify that, the fact that it's online doesn't make it okay. It's still illegal. So AB 831 was put in place to make that clarification, and to add a provision to the criminal code to make sure that it was underlined that this is illegal criminal activity in California.
Well, Scott, I mean, that's a pretty huge. We've come a long way in a year. One of these things that I heard when I was in Vegas this last time was people were talking about how the market was, pushing these investment deals, as legitimate. A lot of guys, a lot of people on Wall Street, a lot of people in the market said this is a legitimate investment, and that's what they were. All of a sudden, everybody was involved, and there was a lot of people. There were a lot of people and companies that were in the regulated industry that decided to go over to sweepstakes. Companies like WorldPay, uh, um, um, Playtech, companies that are very well respected in the industry. What does it mean for these guys going forward, Scott?
Well, bad news. I mean, fortunately, the what distinguishes this from the internet cafe days are one, that huge influx of legitimate capital that came in, to the business, and just the sheer volume. We were still, in the PASPA, days with internet cafes, where now, mobile gaming, is, legitimate in most jurisdictions across the country. And so, that's what, I think properly, in large part to you, Victor, and in this webinar, bringing people's attention, to what was just becoming, an overwhelming matter. I will admit, I was skeptical, when Sam Manuel first proposed, going with the legislature. I was looking at Attorney General Bonta and his him-hawing about, any type of gaming issue, and thought, oh, great, he's just going to point to the legislation as an excuse not to do anything. But the legislation went through with such blinding speed and such overwhelming support, that even before you see, the threat of actual enforcement action, you see major operators and suppliers saying, "We're out. We're getting out of here." Um, and as Howard pointed out, these enforcement actions, by a number of other states, the cease and desist letters that have come out of Michigan and Arizona and Massachusetts, have frankly had, a very, very positive impact, to where you're seeing, a lot of people, closing up shop, or at least geofencing off those jurisdictions that are crying foul. But as I stated while we were talking beforehand, I want to see more dead bodies. I want to see nails and coffins. The tide has turned. And I think the California legislation, will be looked at as maybe the key turning point. But these operators are still out there. Um, and it creates a chilling effect of the legitimate social gaming market that's truly, not for pay. Uh, um, so it's a great improvement in the situation, but we still have unfinished business, and I think, the AG Bontas of the world, need to wake up and make, not just enforcement against sweepstakes a priority, but the enforcement against unlawful internet gaming in all the various forms. I point out that, you started this a year ago, and I don't think the word prediction markets was even part of our vocabulary in October of
Not
last
till
year.
January. Not till January. That's when that came in our vocabulary, you know. But Scott, I agree with you 100%, because if Lawrence Escalante and VGW walk away from this, I think it's a complete failure of the system of the California, and it goes to the rest of the states, but allowing your state to be pick dry. These organizations that supported it, the SPGA, the SLGA, they didn't even exist last year after G2E. They didn't begin to exist until after our first webinar. Once they realized that we were onto them, and that, we were going to come out and come after them hard, they formed these AstroTurf trade groups that were just totally ineffective. But until we claw back this money for the California taxpayer, which I think is a great narrative in California, And then I think that's when our job will be close to being done. So we're like halfway. This is phase one. We got the bill passed. Phase two now is enforcement and disgorgement. You know what I mean? And I
And I
think
think,
anything less than that, it's a failure. Go ahead, Michael. I
no, I was
apologize.
just going to say, building on that, I think one of the purposes of AB 831, like I said earlier, was to clarify this is illegal. So hopefully now, AG Bonta as well as DAs, county DAs throughout California have this as a tool and see this, the fact that it did go through both the Senate and the Assembly without a single no vote. Every committee, every vote, it got unanimous approval. The governor signed, on Saturday. So hopefully they all see this as a clear green light to go and start going after the companies. And I think another important thing that Howard mentioned that you mentioned is the fact that AB 831 is not just the providers, but the idea is to make it impossible for the providers to function in California by essentially cutting off all of the support that they would need through platform providers, financing, payment processors, et cetera. It kind of lumps everybody into this. So hopefully for those next steps, we will see not just going after like stake.com. We saw that recent lawsuit out of LA. The LA city attorney brought a case, not just against the operator, but against all of the affiliates and all the people that are making it possible for that operator to operate. So hopefully post AB 831, we'll see more cases like that that are even stronger because now all those prosecutors, all those attorney generals, DAs have hopefully clear law that they can enforce in California.
That's what we want. That's exactly what we want, and that's where we're going on this. And Howard, so how do you think AB1 will resonate beyond the borders of California?
Well, Victor, I'd say this. Let's not delude ourselves about this. Sweepstakes gaming is just one flavor in a Baskin-Robbins ice cream shop full of illegal gambling choices. And it's not even the biggest or most popular one. It's a sliver. And, there's a reason why these kinds of products have seen explosive growth. Uh, Consumers, sweepstakes gaming, if it proved nothing else, is that there is an immense consumer demand for online gambling. And as long as there's somebody willing to step up, take the legal risk, if there is any, has the technology and the marketing to do it, those products are going to thrive because there is very scarce legal opportunity to satisfy that consumer demand. That's the imbalance that you have. Strong consumer demand and no outlet for it that's legal. So the illegal operations are going to proliferate. It was sweepstakes yesterday. It's prediction markets today. It's going to be something else tomorrow until you address that underlying dynamic. And this is not a small problem. In California, the estimate of illegal online gambling, it's many billions of dollars. You're probably looking at $40 billion of online sports wagering taking place in the state annually. $40 billion of wagering. And I'm not advocating one way or another. I'm just saying this is the issue to face. If you go into a bar on Sunday that's playing football games all day and there's 50 guys in there, 45 of them are betting online on illegal sports applications. The other five lost their money on Thursday, and that's the only reason they're not playing on Sunday. This is a business that exclusively belongs to the tribes. And until you resolve that issue, and I know that there are differences of opinion, and maybe the tribes will ultimately decide they don't want to be in the online gaming business. But until you resolve it one way or another, that business, which otherwise should legally belong to the tribes, is going to be going somewhere else. And online casino gaming is multiples of what the sports betting market is. The estimates are, we're talking about what they call GGR, or gross gaming revenue, is about $4 billion in sports betting that the tribes are not getting, and $8 billion in online gaming. That's $12 billion of revenue gross. It's probably $6 billion in net revenue. That's a lot of money to leave on the table. and somebody is going to capture it, and somebody is going to capture those customers, and you're going to keep playing whack-a-mole, trying to tamp down the next thing that they come up with to circumvent the current law until we address that issue. And I think while we're focused, hurrah, you did very well on sweepstakes, that is just the canary in the coal mine of this fundamental issue. What are you going to do about this underlying dynamic?
If
Well,
I could
go
weigh
ahead.
in,
Go ahead,
I,
Scott.
I agree with that 1,000%. The most effective way to make a huge dent in the illegal mobile gaming market is to provide a legal outlet for players to be able to access. I believe it's the AGA that recently, put out a study that pointed out that, most players in these states aren't even aware that they're accessing an illegal site, and if they had the choice, they would prefer the legal site. So in states like California, the best thing that can be done to make a huge dent into this illegal activity, is to provide, the legal access, for players to be able to turn to. But the other thing I really liked about Sam Manuel's bill is the myriad of new or enhanced enforcement tools, the disgorgement, the expansion beyond the operators to the providers and the enablers. I believe it's Wyoming's recent legislation actually even penalizes the player who accesses the site. Um, Providing these various incentives, whether it be the plaintiffs' bars or the DAs or the state AGs, the need to provide additional enforcement mechanisms to be able to make it a priority. I mean, one of the things I meant to mention this before. One of the things I was frustrated with on the front end of the Sam Manuel bill is, well, okay, so we're going to the legislature to get a law to declare that what's already clearly illegal is illegal is illegal, and was really wondering the wisdom of that. But it's those extra enhancement tools, and then just the pure message that came along with the overwhelming, support and speed in which that law went into existence, I think, provides both the wake-up call and, in some respects, the political cover for AGs, not just in California but around the country, to give this issue the priority that it deserves in terms of using their resources towards enforcement against illegal gambling.
So this law kicks in on January 1st, right?
Yes.
And so
Got
so
an emergency language and we didn't.
yeah, do you expect a legal challenge from these guys? I mean, they've Howard, you know this better than everyone. They've run from the cease and desist. We've seen no legal challenges. They've run again, the SLGA and the SPGA didn't exist until after G2E. So, these guys were not prepared to fight for this.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was all, arbitrage and until we woke up and started focusing on them, they ran from state to state. And by the way, Howard, you chased them from state to state, which was quite amusing. It was like get
We've
that
seen a
Benny,
lot of state capitals in the last year.
put that Benny
You know,
Hill
I
music back there, man. Put that Benny Hill music on behind you, chasing those
Well, you
guys.
make an important point that, this is the actions that we talked about in these 17 states. Not one has been challenged by any of the sweepstakes operators, unlike in the prediction market scenario, where immediately you've gone to the mattresses on the judicial side of things. That didn't happen in sweepstakes for a variety of reasons. But I'm less concerned at this point about a legal challenge. Those aren't going to happen. Instead, they'll find ways around the law. For example, today, there is one sweepstakes operator that announced they're going to use a triple currency system. Now, remember, the California law focuses on dual currency because that was the mechanism. So is it going to be okay if you use a triple currency? Now it's three card Monty, literally. You're playing in order to hide the ball here, to obscure the fact that this is really gambling. And so, you may need to make some changes in the law or the regulation to add a multi-currency system. Goes back to my prior point. You can't always play catch up. You'll always be behind. The legislative process is lengthy and difficult. The regulators don't have the capacity. You're always going to be fighting from the rear if this is the approach that we take, and they'll stay a step ahead of you on finding new mechanisms to tap that consumer demand. And we've got to have a conversation in the states that have not at this point taken on online gaming. If you're not going to have online gaming, and that's the policy decision you make, fine. What is the enforcement going to be? You can't make one decision, no iGaming, and then have no enforcement, which is kind of the situation that we're in today, despite some of the wins that we've had. So I think that the industry needs to refocus instead of what battle are we fighting today? We're fighting the other guy's battles and get ahead of it and decide what is the future going to look like. And for the tribes, this is the most important thing. For commercial states, they got a lot of different things happening. The tribal exclusivity is sovereignty. This is a tribal sovereignty issue. And the fact that you have on every phone, on every resident, 24 hours a day, the ability to gamble in your state right now is an absolute dagger to the heart of the whole concept of sovereignty, and it cannot stand.
Well, Michael, you know what I mean? He has a very valid point. I mean, that was, one of the reasons why the tribe Yehoviatam was, very quick to act because it was a violation of their sovereignty. And as one of the arguments they used against the tribe was you guys already had social gaming up. The big difference was, these guys were spending every single penny they had to grab market share. I thought that was very amusing during that one report. They were talking about how much money they were going to spend in California. It all went to Facebook and Apple and to promote their own businesses. So they were very disingenuous every single step of the way. But he brings up a really good question. You guys are in the marketplace. What is next? We can't keep swatting them away.
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think when you're talking about illegal gaming, not just sweepstakes, but you're talking about sweepstakes, you're talking about, the predictions markets, all the offshore gaming that's happening, some of the daily fantasy sports. When that's being offered, when that's not being stopped, at least when they're not geofencing, they're coming in and offering gaming on tribal lands. I mean, you could go into Yamava at San Manuel, the casino that Yahavia Thomas has, and you could buy, a predictions market contract today. You could enter into one of these sweepstakes. Hopefully that's not going to be the case much longer, but you could. And it's a huge infringement on tribal sovereignty, on a tribe's rights and authority, its sovereign authority to determine what gaming is allowed on that tribe's lands and to control and regulate that gaming. And if the tribe doesn't want it, to be able to stop that gaming from occurring on its Indian land. So that's definitely not unique to sweepstakes. I think it's a huge issue that is at the heart of a lot of the things that we're talking about and a lot of the reasons that I think you see tribes stepping up. It's not just about bottom line. It's not just about competition. In fact, when it comes to sweepstakes, it's not competition at all because frankly, we weren't competing with them. Right. It's about sovereignty. It's about a tribe's ability to control the gaming and the activities that are happening on its lands. And I think that's why you're seeing tribes come out as ferociously as they have on sweepstakes, and frankly, as they are right now on the other threats such as predictions markets.
Right.
Yeah, it's an impact to all tribes everywhere. Most affected are the tribes in states like California or Washington, where you have true tribal exclusivity. But picking up on one of the comments Howard make, this is also a question of state sovereignty. If Texas and Utah say, well, well, not only are sweepstakes or prediction markets illegal in our state, but every form of gaming is, and sit back and sit on those laurels. Think again. Online gaming is in your state right now, and in its affront to that state's sovereignty and the disregard and disrespect of that state's regulatory schemes and laws, that is at stake as well. One of the things that I find interesting, not just in the sweepstakes venue, but in the prediction market venue as well, is our most natural allies in this particular arena, are the states themselves, and figuring out how to work with states to bring a cessation, or at least a great um, erosion of the amount of illegal gaming that's going on, particularly in the mobile environment.
While we're at G2E, the big conversations were about prediction markets, on that, was it Wednesday when they started losing billions of dollars, and then they had the other poly market investment while we were in G2E. So it seems prediction markets, what we saw with DFS after PASPA, we're seeing with prediction markets, and it's kind of forcing everybody's hands. I think everyone's now either has to there's no
Yeah.
sitting on the sideline anymore. I think, the conversations that I heard at a very high level where, okay, how are we going to do this? We still believe that, we should be very careful in going forward. But, like you said, there's a casino in every pocket. There's a gambler with every person that has a phone. Are you going to service these gamblers, or are you just going to play defense forever? So I think it's forced a lot of tribal people, not just in California, but the other states, to think about, where they're going with this issue. And, are they going to occupy that space once they clear it out? I think that's a really important
Yeah. I
question,
mean,
especially in California.
and think about, you know, what the ultimate beneficiary is all about. You're California, you're looking at these, $6 billion of net gaming revenue that's being taken out of the pockets unknowingly, really, of California residents. To Scott's point, they don't know that they're playing on illegal sites, and it's going to Malta, and it's going to, offshore sites, and they're using tribal members and residents as an ATM to fund whatever their needs are over there. And that's money that belongs to the tribes and the good works that the tribes do in the communities, right? The tribes receive good revenue from gambling and reinvest that in their communities. And while it's not necessarily only about the money, it is also about the ability to fund those good practices that benefit tribal members. And that's a lot. If you look at that $6 billion, even if you looked at it just spread evenly, that's $60 million per year per tribe annuity. I don't know what the trust fund does today, like $1 million or something, per tribe a year. Now you've got an ability of probably closer to $60 million a year. So that's the scale that we're talking about. And that money is going to line the pockets today of overseas, primarily investors, and frankly, unknown beneficiaries, because the very definition of money laundering is what we're seeing with online offshore gambling. It's money that's raised through an illegal means, and it is siphoned overseas, and no one really knows what happens to it. There's a great deal of documentation, and I'm not pointing a finger at any given company, but there's a lot of documentation about the relationship between online gambling, illegal online gambling, and drug trafficking, human trafficking, and criminal activity, because we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars writ large coming out of the United States that is free money that goes abroad. So there's a lot of reasons to tackle this problem, but perhaps the primary one is, what could you do in the communities and in the tribal nations with the revenue that's currently going, who knows where.
You bring up an interesting point. At some point last year, I did a poll on LinkedIn asking if I should talk about sweepstakes when I was in Barcelona. And I had a bunch of people vote on it. And I thought the no's were really interesting. And when I checked them, some of them were regulators from other countries. So, like the Isle of Man and some of these other regulators. And it was kind of shocking to me at the time. I was like, why would a regulator from the Isle of Man not want to hear about illegal sweepstakes in California? You know what I mean? Which is a bigger issue and a global issue when you got uh, Australia, which is the home to VGW and these guys, and you have these countries that don't care about the sovereignty of a state like California. These guys are buying billion-dollar mansions and are spending billions of dollars in real estate in Australia and stuff like that. And yet they're taking all that money out of California and Australia doesn't do anything. You know what I mean? And so no wonder the Chinese were pissed off at them, you know? So, I think that's another issue we should be talking globally about these regulators that allow these things to happen. I think it's a direct infringement on who and what we are as sovereign tribes of California, and more importantly, the state of California and its sovereignty too. Sometimes the tribes got to stick up and fight for our older sibling. You know what I mean? That's kind of what we do, right, Scott?
Unfortunately, we do it too much. I was glad to see AG Bonta sign on to the letter that all AGs signed on to DOJ, saying, DOJ, you need to step up against these offshore operators. But that was low-hanging fruit. We need to see Bonta and others actually step up and follow through. I mean, he got headlines saying he meant what he said with the DFS opinion, and that he's going to take enforcement action. Well, that was what, months ago now, and we've yet to see anything happen. In fact, there's major operators out there that have announced that they're going from bank to peer, and therefore they're going to continue operating when Bonta's opinion clearly said whether it's banked or to peer, it's a violation of California law. Talk is cheap. They've got to, like I said, I want nails and coffins. I want dead bodies. Just saying that while I agree that it's illegal, doesn't stop the activity from occurring.
By the way, I agree with Scott 100%. Scott, I have an idea. What we do is we deputize those ICE agents out there to go after the sweepstakes too. So, they can catch them at their Home Depot, Taco Bell, wherever these guys go. You know what I mean?
Well, that's probably not a good idea. But what is a good
Think
idea?
about it, Scott. I'm still spitballing, but just think about it,
I do think, making, maybe in various tribes and compact negotiations should say, look, you're going to take some of our revenue, you're going to designate or, a department within your AG's office that is exclusively manned and funded for the purpose of going after illegal gaming activity. It's got to translate to enforcement activity in order for it to truly be effective.
I agree. I agree 100%, Gentlemen, so what's next? The bill signed. Today is, Wednesday after Saturday. I was very excited on Saturday. So, what happens next?
Well, hopefully, over the next couple months, all these sweepstakes companies at least leave California. I mean, ideally, that's what happens. It's pretty clear now it's illegal. They shouldn't be operating here. And if they stick around, then hopefully, the Attorney General, DAs, LA city prosecutors, other city prosecutors start bringing more cases against the ones that are sticking around and thumbing their nose at the law, or
Yeah,
trying to come up with clever workarounds like Howard mentioned to say, well, technically now we're not violating this law because I,
Right.
I agree with that completely. That's what they have a history of doing. So I don't expect anything different. We've heard similar things where it's not coins anymore. We're buying something else. So
Right.
I anticipate they're going to keep doing this. It's just going to be up to prosecutors to bring good cases to try and kind of nip that stuff in the bud.
That's 100% right. They're going to clearly test the law. Some will exit right away, or they'll make a big show about exiting while they come up with a different product type. But to Scott's earlier point, this is already illegal gambling under the law, right? This just kind of put a fine point on it and added some flesh to those bones. There's plenty of opportunity for enforcement entities, AG, local DAs like we saw in Los Angeles, to continue to keep the heat on, and they will have to do that. Otherwise, if you leave any openings, the water's going to run downhill and find a way back to flood the system. So you can't just walk away from this at this point. We talked about how you've also got to deal with the underlying consumer demand that is there, and then I think the third piece, which we touched on, is the fact that the federal government has been utterly absent from all of this. This is not a California problem. It's not a New York problem. It's not a Louisiana, Mississippi problem. It's a national problem that crosses borders, and it's a violation of U.S. borders. There's not an internet digital wall. We built a wall on the southern border, but there's no digital wall that keeps out internet bad actors, and that's going to be a federal role to kind of create that. Otherwise, essentially, you're allowing these foreign bad actors to plunder the U.S. economy and U.S. residents. So this is something I think the AG's letter is helpful as a statement of this joint letter we talked about. All 50 or 50 state AGs signed it. That's a positive sign. But what is next there? How do you really get a determination that there's going to be a commitment from the federal government? There has been no interest, none to date, from the Department of Justice, from any of the financial task forces, FinCEN, et cetera. I think that may change over time because the situation on the ground in the states is unsustainable as it is. But it's a complicated bag to get into. A lot of politics involved, obviously, at the national level as to whether or not to take this issue on. There are a lot of other things that are going on, nationally. They're taking up a lot of space. So I think that Michael's right. Got to keep the pressure on with local law enforcement in the state, but there's got to be a united effort among multiple states and through Congress. One of the reasons why this was successful in California is, and we found this overall, regulators tended not to want to move unless they knew that their legislators were in the same place, right? Regulators are risk averse. And when sweepstakes first came up, what we saw from regulators in various states, some were more aggressive than others, but by and large, they needed a kind of an informal okay. And the process of doing the laws, and Scott made a point earlier, we were also a little skeptical about should we do legislative activity, because would that undermine the idea that, well, it must already be legal if you need a law. But ultimately, the end of last year or so, we said, let's try a few state laws in various locations as a way to make it safe for regulators to then get in the game and prompt them. That same process really will need to happen at a congressional level to put some pressure on federal law enforcement officials to take action. I think that's the next step. But I think we're kind of in the infancy of that right now.
Well, you know what? Go ahead. Go, Michael.
No, I was just going to say, just to kind of add to that, I 100% agree with that. And just to build a little bit on the idea of what role the federal government can play here. I would remind everybody out there, especially anybody that's listening from, tribal gaming industry. There is a federal law that applies to gaming activity on Indian lands, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. I would encourage everybody to also, reach out to the NIGC, the National Indian Gaming Commission, the Department of Justice's Office of Tribal Justice, to let them know that, you have concerns about this. I think that they need to hear from Indian country as well, just like, regulators need to know that there's some pressure to act, that there is concern out there. NIGC doesn't operate in a vacuum. I acknowledge that. They have to work with the Department of Justice. They have to work with other federal agencies like the Department of the Interior. However, I think that there is a role that they can play, not just on sweepstakes, which I think is clearly gaming, and like I said earlier, it's being offered on Indian lands, but also with events contracts, with all this offshore gaming. I mean, it's a lot for anybody to try and swallow, and that and believe me, I know NIGC has their hands full just with their regular day-to-day enforcement and regulatory mandate. But I do think that they need to hear from people that this is an issue that tribes care about and want to see some action on.
Michael, thank you so much for bringing that up. And I forgot to mention that Michael used to be with the NIGC. That's when we first met. So that's a very, very, very important take. I think we've seen a lot of the regulators weren't sure how to act, whether be it, for the council. And I think here in California, I think this gives them a clear directive that this is definitely illegal. And I think, we kind of surprised the industry. I think everyone in the industry was so focused on online gaming and stuff, they didn't see this coming. But, it kind of happens with the entire industry. Scott, that's a really good take on the regulators and their role in this. The NIGC has been, some say they have been missing it, but I know they've been very busy. They have keeping their eye on this good people, but I think like everybody else, they were kind of taken back by it. Have you got any direction from the NIGC?
Uh, I know that it's on the radar screen. I know that they're very concerned. But if I can more generalize to, the federal government generally, is frankly, we have a lot of, really dedicated, knowledgeable, experienced civil servants that want to do the right thing, but also are in, a very awkward environment to where, they could be punished for doing the right thing. Unfortunately, I think, as much as we like to think that, um, you know, uh, looking at your face in the mirror is more important than your weekly paycheck. I don't think that's the real world reality. And so, although I think we should continue to push on federal enforcement, um, I'm, as Howard said, there's a lot of other issues that are probably of higher priority that are going to need to be addressed on the federal level first before we see any real federal improvement. But Michael hit on one thing that I've noticed as well is more recently, I think in the prediction market context, you've seen now I think Arizona and Ohio, I think Pennsylvania, where they've issued letters saying, "Hey, you licensed entities out there,
Yes.
think that you can move forward with with business relationships with these illegal operators and it not impact your license or your suitability determination, in that particular jurisdiction." I remember, in the early 90s, when a number of tribes, the only way they could get up and started is in a gray market environment, and you were dealing in a situation where legitimate licensed companies wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole because they knew getting into one squabble, in one jurisdiction could jeopardize their licenses in multiple jurisdictions. And that seemed to have gone away. And now I'm seeing in these conversations with sweepstakes and prediction markets, I'm seeing that element bubble up again, which I think is a very good development. People need
That,
to understand that that the fact that you've got a license over here and you're dealing with an illegal operator in this other jurisdiction, is going to impact you where you have a valid license. And I think that's part of those enforcement mechanisms that all need to be ginned up at the same time to try to bring this activity to a close.
I would say be careful what we ask for there. If you can operate a national sports betting or gambling operation without taxation, without gambling regulation, uh, then what do you need a license for in any given state? And if you're theoretically a digital sports company today, one of the big ones, let's not name them, but if you're a digital sports company and you're looking at what the environment looks like, and state of Michigan or somebody comes to you and says, if you get involved in prediction markets, we're gonna sanction your license. Well, give the license back. It doesn't matter anymore. If you can operate without it on a national basis, what do you need a license for? You don't need it. So, we're in very uncharted territory over here, and I think this is one reason why the regulators stepped up in a more uniform and aggressive manner more quickly on prediction markets than they did on sweepstakes, because prediction markets are a challenge to the regulation system itself. It's a challenge to the regulator. It says, we don't need you. We can operate uh, completely independently of it. And that is fundamentally, an existential threat to the regulator and the regulated system themselves in a way that sweepstakes maybe wasn't seen the same way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on here, and hard to know. And this is why you see, I think, some of the digital sports companies haven't exactly put a marker down as to where they're going to be, right? On prediction markets.
I think
They're
it's a
keeping, they're keeping their options open. Let's put it that way.
That's an extremely valid point, and what distinguishes prediction markets from all these other forms of illegal gaming that we're talking about, is the legal basis on which they're operating.
Reporting. Yeah,
It's truly, an existential threat in the truest sense of the word, and if they are correct, why, you're going to see, you know, state and tribal regulated mobile gaming become irrelevant.
right.
It's no
You only
tax.
need one court to make that decision, right? One
Well,
court, 9 guys and gals make a
yeah.
decision that you can operate essentially gambling under commodities futures trading. That's it. It's game over for the gambling industry as we know it, and I think that's what's created the reaction that you've seen so far.
Well, it's
Well,
headed there, and although they had those great initial victories, I think it is important that the same judge that ruled in favor of Kalshi recently ruled against Robinhood in Nevada. You got the negative ruling in Maryland. I think that you're hopefully you're seeing the tide turning in that litigation. But you're right. We now have conflicting opinions, and which really sets the stage for nine particular black robes to decide what the CEA really means when it says no event contracts on gaming.
well, I think, if it wasn't for sweepstakes, I don't think the tribes would have been in a better, the
True.
position they were to start fighting prediction markets, because they were already running in that direction, and they were awake and they were fighting, and some of us had our hair on fire, and but the tribes were up and fighting. They were united, they were focused, and all of a sudden they're like, "What? We got to fight over here too," which is, not unusual, but I think, the sweepstakes did us a big favor by having us organized and pointed in the right directions when sweepstakes comes. And by the way, I think, it's really about addressing this issue of the gamification. The DFS guys knew when they were doing house bank that they were doing gambling. They thought they were being clever by half, thinking they can get away with it until we started. They saw us, what happened to the sweepstakes, and I think everybody is concerned that the tribes will turn their considerable might towards them, and that's a very real threat to them. Because I think everywhere is threats. I don't think we're delusional by saying that. I just think the new reality is that you have to, this new generation of gambling that mobile has brought on is the next threat. Either we join it or we get rolled over by it. But we can't play defense forever, you know. But again, I think we were in a good position to fight take on these next fights. We're ready, and I think with prediction markets, you see some. I think it was that judge in Nevada came out with another
Very important. Yeah.
and a very important one. It's saying that you can't have swaps and saying it's gambling. And I know the guys in prediction markets were losing their minds yesterday, and they're losing their minds today. So I've always felt, I think we all agree in this, on this podcast that this is going to go into the Supreme Court and it's going to be a states' right issue. And I just really find it hard to believe that the same Supreme Court that turned over past, but for states' rights is going to say, no, we didn't mean that. You know what I mean? So we are preparing for that fight. It's existential. I think it's not just for us, but for states' rights and for the state of California and for the tribes of California, and more importantly, I think for the taxpayers of California, you know, all that revenue that's going out. So, gentlemen, we are almost over. Let me get a couple of these questions in here too before we end. And I want to thank everybody for using your real names. It's really helpful. As you know, I don't answer anonymous questions unless it's to hiss and bark at them. Uh, Andrew Matherly said, oh, why isn't our federal NIGC and various state regulators making comments on what is legal and not? This is their response. This is their responsibility to enforce the elements of gaming. Michael, is it their responsibility or are they waiting for us to ask for guidance?
Well, I think, the NIGC certainly has jurisdiction over all gaming activity that happens on Indian lands. I think it certainly helps when tribes go to NIGC and say, hey, this is something that's happening. It's something that we're concerned about. It's a problem. We think you need to look into it. I think, though, also NIGC, of course, it's a federal agency. It has to act deliberately, whatever it does, especially when you're talking about an enforcement action. It takes time to build those cases. It takes time to work. Like I said, NIGC doesn't work in a vacuum. So you need DOJ's cooperation, which, I don't know how easy that is to get right now. But, DOJ, if NIGC does this and these companies sue, which I'm sure they inevitably would under the Administrative Procedures Act, NIGC doesn't get to defend itself. That's up to the Department of Justice. So yes, NIGC, I think, does have a role here, but I think everybody needs to understand that there's a lot of moving parts to that. And I think it's helpful when everybody goes and expresses to NIGC, and not just NIGC, but also DOJ, also Department of the Interior, that this is something that's concerning, and we would like our federal regulators to step in and do something about it.
Well, Howard, the big thing here is language. Everybody's always, prediction markets. It isn't gambling, it's swaps. What if we just call them Antifa? Do you think that would make it move a little quicker? I mean, since everybody's
Well,
just being
like that
all what?
until the next thing happens. Let me just last before we go. Just I'd be remiss and at the risk of sounding obsequious on a show that you invited me into. I just want to note your role in this over the last year, Victor. I didn't know you a year ago, and we met over the course of this, and I don't think anybody has done more to raise the profile and educate people on the issue. You do so in a very unique way, I must say. I remember your tweet earlier this year saying, when this started, don't mess with the California tribes. Although I think you didn't use the word mess. Possibly, I might be mistaken on that. But you just, I want to acknowledge, what you accomplished here. A lot of people, obviously, and organizations were involved, but you put yourself out there in a way that really nobody else has. And I just want to acknowledge that. Thank you for that.
As Gene said, you lit the match, my friend. You know what I mean? And we really appreciate your assistance, your help, your guidance, and bringing the knowledge and helping us to get up and running really quick. That was very important. Scott, you want to give us the last word, my friend?
Well, I just reiterate what Howard said. With these issues, it's under the dark of night that these companies have been able to get away with it, and your platform, shines bright sunshine on it. And once people see it for whether it's sweepstakes, dual currency, or whether it's prediction market contracts, when you put the bright light of day on it, you see that it's gaming and it's not approved gaming, And yes, you played a critical role, and it's very much appreciated, I believe, by all of Indian country.
Listen, we couldn't have done it without the leadership of Chairman Stevens, man. When we took off, he was once he realized, he was like, "Go get him, boys." You know what I mean? So I think one of my favorite things, someone called me. I had an interview with someone. They said, I know you're one of Chairman Stevens' attack dogs," and I laughed and I said, "Thank you very much. That's like the best compliment I've ever had." So in my role in almost 30 years, Scott, when I started Pachanga.net, and, it's always been about defending the tribes and tribal sovereignty. And, Jason Giles is just a monster at it too. He does a great job on the Hill too. So having great partners, the IGA, great partners with Siva, Chairman Siva from CNIGA, and the leadership of, the tribes in California. I remember someone asked at one point, when I was going off on a rant, they go, "Can he do that? Can he do all that stuff that I was saying?" But the answer was no. But I knew how the tribes would react, and I knew how my tribe would react. I knew how other tribes in California react when they understood the threat. So I was just pointing out where the threat was. And it's been an honor to be in this fight, and it's been an honor to be with you guys and become friends with Howard and get to know Michael even better. And Scott, we've been buddies for a long time. So, gentlemen, thank you very much. This is just the beginning of the fight. We have not begun to fight. And let's keep going. And thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who joined us. We'll see you guys next week. We're going to be talking about prediction markets and everything that's gone on over the last couple of weeks. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Thanks so much.